Sorayam Tovim. I am Dr. Jeffrey Schein, the director of the Mordecai Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. And it's really my delight to have with me as a conversational partner and someone with great expertise in the area of Jewish law, American law, Judaism, democracy, Dr. Elliot Dorff. Um, Dr. Dorff is a conservative rabbi. He's a graduate of the seminary. He has served the conservative movement in many ways on their law committees. He's also been an advisor to three different federal commissions about law and several state. And for 35 years, it looks like to me, he taught about Jewish law at UCLA. And for our purposes, I can call him a personal friend very easily, but also a friend of the Kaplan Center. I remember way back to the days at Camp Ramah, 1980 to 82, when I was there with Elliot and his wife Marlon. Some of his children were the boards of my wife, who is the Gunnenet, having good conversations about Kaplan, his uses, his unfilled potential, the perhaps the structural lackings within his thought. Always good dialogues. And most recently, Elliot joined four other people in October of 2022 for a webinar on in the sukkah of the voting booth. This was right before the 2022 elections, and several people who are really consumers of the material we put out at the Kaplan Center have remarked what a meaningful webinar that was. And I have one, actually, the president of the Kaplan Center, who at least once every 6 months will go back to something that Elliot said and say, are we taking this into account as we move forward? So it is really such a great privilege to be on this with Elliot. I want to emphasize that its structure is not a lecture or even a lecture with questions. It's a conversation, and it seemed to me important, and Elliot was such a great person, so gracious to join us, an important conversation when one stops for a moment and thinks about all that's happened in the last year and a half in regard to democracy. So this is a chance for us as we do a series of learning units and web postings based on Mordecai Kaplan's selections about democracy that we're sharing and we're using for adult study next year to revisit someone who has thought deeply about the subject matter and to update it. Some of those questions feel like they could be asked about any time, any context, or universal. And indeed, we never live in universal times, we live in our times. So, with all those thank yous and that prelude, I'm going to ask Elliot some questions, invite him to be comfortable. I'm sure he will be, and speculative if he chooses. And the first question is, Elliot, if you think back over the last few years, would you say you're an American? You're an American Jew, that American democracy has become stronger or weaker?
Well, certainly since the advent of former President Trump, I think it has become weaker, unfortunately, because he and many of the people who support him are challenging the legitimacy of the very institutions of American democracy. We just saw that recently in terms of insulting the witnesses, the jury, and the judge in the trial to which where he was found guilty of what is 34, I think, felonies. And he doesn't really and he says that he would probably pardon, if he were to be reelected, pardon all the people who were part of the January 6th, I'll say, insurrection, in order to try to deny President Biden his rightful position as president. So, I mean, in that sense, I think it's gotten much weaker. And I think also the other piece of it is that I'm old enough to remember that Republicans and Democrats actually talked to each other and created policies together. And that has become much, much less common now. And that I think is really very unfortunate because the United States in which I grew up, and by the way, I was born and raised in Milwaukee, and Wisconsin politics were, if anything, very divided. I mean, on the one hand,
Mhm.
it was the state that elected Joe McCarthy as a senator, right? And all of that that happened in the 1940s and 50s with the Russian scare and all of that. And on the other hand, Milwaukee had a socialist mayor for 20 some years and has elected a lot of Democrats to office. But recently, Scott Walker was the governor, a very staunch
Mhm.
Republican, right? So I grew up in a state that really is purple in that sense. Uh,
Right.
and but people got along, and Midwest nice, as we used to call it, right? And that doesn't mean that we agreed with each other, but it did mean that we could live together, we could talk together, and have mutual respect. And I
Right.
think that was true for the members elected to Congress as well as, you know, the various presidencies and the like. I'm very much afraid of that whole structure being completely compromised by the inability of Americans to talk to each other respectfully and to agree as to what is fact. You may disagree as to what we should do with the fact, but we have to begin with some sense of being, you know, there is such a thing as truth, and there is such a thing as science. I mean, those kinds of things, right? That I think we really have to
Mhm.
start with. That said, I must say I'm a very proud American for a whole series of reasons, and one of which is just this is the most pluralistic society that has ever existed on the face of the earth. I've been part of the priest-rabbi dialogue in Los Angeles since it began in 1973, and
Mhm.
one of my priest friends told me that in Los Angeles diocese, Mass is offered in 80 different languages.
Wow, that is impressive.
That is
Yeah.
indeed impressive, right? It's not just Spanish and English; it's 80 different languages, and that's because it needs to be offered in all of those languages. And yet, I mean, it's not. It's certainly America has never been, you know, it's certainly not been an ideal society. We've had some major bumps in the road, right? I mean, slavery clearly is one.
Mhm.
A lot of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 30s, and then again, resurrecting itself, unfortunately, now um, questions about immigration and denial of climate change about 20 years ago. I mean, it's not as if we've been a perfect society, but it is a society in which people from multiple backgrounds have by and large been able to live together. And all you have to do is just look at what's happened in various countries in Europe and elsewhere, and you see that not at all to be taken for granted. I mean, it's something that we really have to consider ourselves to be blessed about. And that this is also a country where it's a kind of can-do country, right? I mean, when I think about the United States, I think about two fundamental things. One is individual rights, even more so than in other European democracies. You can sue the government in the United States. You can't do that in most other countries, right? So I mean, and then there's a very strong sense of individualism in America that leads to a lot of creativity in all kinds of areas of life, the arts and science and technology and medicine. I mean, all of that because of the fact that we are individuals with rights and and we not only respect each other but challenge each other to be creative. And the other piece of America that I think about always is technological know-how. I mean, the United I do a lot of bioethics. Almost all of the advances in medicine have happened have come as a result of what has happened in the United States. Israel now, by the way, is doing a lot of that, but
Mhm.
much more. But the United States just is at the forefront of technological know-how and all of that, and that's something again to be proud of. There, you know, to look for solutions to problems that can happen both with mutual respect and with technological know-how. I mean, that's America for me, right?
Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you, Elliot. I think I'm going to bring in Jane Susswine, our president here, in one of the conversations I've had with her several times. So she was very taken in October on something that's deeply embedded in your writings, that we have different cultural traditions, and the American tradition, I am now droshing on Elliot Dorff, I hope I have this right,
Right,
has a primary language of rights and a significant but much quieter second language of responsibilities.
right,
And Judaism is really the mirror of that. It has the primary language of responsibilities and a second, quieter language of rights. And I'm wondering, if you look at it bagadol in big, whether we are at a point where we're reaping the benefits of both those civilizations. Do we have something near the right balance of rights and responsibilities in the lives that we live day to day?
well, I think the go at it from both ends, okay?
Okay,
Um,
please.
so let me start from the Jewish end. I mean, I do a lot of interfaith work, and what I very often say to Christian and Muslim audiences, and is that Judaism spells responsibility with a capital R, right?
Mhm.
Achrayut is I still remember when I was in my door, the counselor training program at Camp Ramah. Achrayut was the slogan of the summer, right? You're responsible for this, that, and the other thing, right?
Right.
Um, and that leads to, I think, a really important sense of commitment to, well, what we now call tikkun olam, right? Fixing the world. That was the words, the phrase that we used for it was gemilut chasadim in rabbinic literature, right?
Mhm.
Acts of loving kindness. Um, the very phrase tikkun olam was originally originated in the Mishnah, where it was in the fourth chapter of Gittin, where the rabbis instituted new rules about divorce, so that a woman would not be stuck in a relationship to a man who had divorced her, but she had no proof of that. Right. So it began as a legal maneuver to try to fix the world, to save women from being agunot, from being chained to their original husbands. Later on, when we get to the Alenu, which is a prayer created in the Middle Ages, we're asking God, the Taken Olam B'Malchut Shaddai, we're asking God to fix the world and make it a kingdom of heaven. Later on in mystical literature, in Kabbalah, Tikkun Olam is basically fixing the world, fixing God. Actually, it's sort of like Humpty Dumpty, right? Fixing God. And it's only really, I think, it's only really in the late 20th century and now in the 21st century that we use the term to talk about fixing the world in terms of societal problems and medical problems and environmental problems and all of that. But it's even though the term is being used in a new way that way, nevertheless, all of those values are really ancient in our
Mhm.
tradition. And I think that's wonderful. It gives us a sense of mission in life. Um, and at the same time, my favorite rabbinic saying, bar none, is Rabbi Tarfon in Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimenu. Yours is not to finish the task, but you are not free to desist from it. So I think it's a recipe for sanity, because for type A personalities, right, if you can't fix the world by tomorrow, why I'm going to go crazy, right? You need to understand that you can't do it that way. I'll tell you a funny story about that in a moment. But on the other hand, you do have a duty to try, right? And I started college in 1961, and President Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So on Thursday, I went to Columbia, and Thursday afternoons, I was teaching seventh graders who were reading on a second grade reading level at a junior high school in Harlem. So I was going to fix the world on Thursday afternoons, except that the second week I was there, they had forgotten all the words I had taught them the first week. Right?
Okay.
Um, this was
Welcome
a
to my
lesson in
world.
humility, among other things, right?
Okay.
Um, but it's very much a lesson of Rabbi Tarfon, right? Namely, yours is not to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. So I think that piece of the Jewish tradition is really important to give meaning to life for all of us, right? And to give us a very strong sense in the Jewish community of being a community, right? Do not, again, Pirkei Avot Hillel here, Al tifrosh min hatzibur, do not separate yourself from the community. In the Talmud, you got Kol Yisrael Revim Zeh B'Zeh, all Israelites are responsible for each other. And by the way, for the non-Jewish world, the
Right.
rabbis in the Tosefta, second century source, say that we Jews have to take care of the poor of the non-Jewish community, the sick of the non-Jewish community, and help people in the non-Jewish community mourn their dead and bury their dead. And I can guarantee you the Romans were not doing the same thing for Jews at the time, right? So there's a
Right.
very strong sense of fixing not only the world for Jews, but for the general population. And I think that's absolutely precious. What, on the other hand, and I think that that can really, sorry, contribute to American civilization, where individual rights means that, yes, I can give charity and I can get a tax deduction for it, but the very word charity comes from the Latin meaning caring. You're an especially caring person if you give charity. Whereas in Hebrew, the word for it is tzedakah, which comes from the root tzedek, meaning justice. You simply are doing what is expected of you if you do something for other people. So I think the communitarian part of Judaism can really contribute, and has already contributed a lot to American society. On the other end of the story, though, the sense of individuality and individual rights, I think can really help to temper some of the negative parts of being of communal living. It is the case that what I do is not your business in a lot of ways, right? And Judaism has that. I mean, it believes that every one of us was created in the image of God. It has very strong protections of privacy that are built into rabbinic literature. I mean, they interpret what Bilam says when he sees the Israelite tents, "Ma tovu alecha Yaakov." How good are your tents, O Jacob? Right. So the rabbis ask, what was so good about them? And they answer, well, the opening of one tent faced the wall of another, as opposed to the opening of another. So that privacy was maintained between them,
Mhm.
right? And you also get laws about Lashon Hara. You may not tell bad things about other people, even if they're true, unless there's a practical need to know. I mean, it's not as if the Jewish tradition doesn't have these protections for individuals. But I think the American emphasis on individuality has enabled American Jews to learn from that to balance the communitarian piece in a healthy way. And I would hope that the American side would also take the Jewish part of the communitarian care for one another and balance the individualism of America in a healthy way as well. And we've done that
I,
to some extent. I mean, when you think
mhm.
about it, there is during the Johnson administration, the Lyndon Johnson, we got Medicare and we got Medi-Cal, right? And during the Obama administration, we got Obamacare. And during the first Bush administration, we got the Americans for Disabilities Act, right? And there is such a thing as food stamps, whether it's funded or not, depends upon the particular regime. But I
Right.
mean, there is a real concern now for homelessness in America, and also for the environment, more on the part of some than on the part of others. But I mean, it's not as if America is just a libertarian society. It's really not. It's a society that tries to balance libertarian values with communal values, and I think that
Right.
that's really precious.
Well, I think that's a reminder of the very important work of Robert Bellah in the mid 80s, The Habits of the Heart, where he points out that we have four different languages around democracy, and several of them have natural communitarian moorings, and
Right.
several of them are really way out there in terms of radical individualism. And I think, and I would just add, because I believe it so strongly, that in this deep interaction between Judaism and Americanism, while um, uh, uh, Judaism can gain a sense of respect for individuality, balancing its drive towards tikkun olam with respect for individuals. Somehow that reminds me of, I forget who was my colleague who said, read carefully, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh. Doesn't say Zeh Lezeh. It's not
Right.
responsible for Zeh Bezeh. We're in their face.
That's
And
right.
there is a kind of claustrophobia that can come about. I
Right.
think the way that America gets paid back by Judaism in a deep and important way is through Judaism's emphasis on a language of textuality, and
Yes.
that's one of many gifts that Judaism, I think, pays back to
Right.
America. I wanted to see, Elliot, if I could get you to do a quick micro focus on something and then a macro bigadol kind of question. The micro is we wind the clock back just a couple weeks to the trial, and I wasn't watching it 24/7, but the famous hush money trial, I did watch a lot of it. What did you find admirable? I think you probably agree with the verdict for a variety of reasons, but what did you find admirable about American civilization and the commitment to law that was coming out constantly in that month process of putting the former president, Lola Hakir Panim, we were putting
Right.
the former president on trial. What did you find admirable in that
Well,
process?
first of all, this is, as I said just earlier, we were talking about some of the ways in which the American tradition and the Jewish tradition disagree. But one of the ways in which they agree is that even the highest people in public office are bound by the law. Deuteronomy 17 requires that a king write a copy of the Torah and have it with him at all times. So even to indicate to the fact that even an ancient Jewish king was bound by the law. And the same sort of thing is what happened during the trial of former President Trump over the hush money stuff. And even though he was doing his very best to undermine the system ultimately won out, right? And and he had his fair trial, and he had his fair day in court. He had his lawyer. He had what he certainly had a lot of legal support. Unfortunately, much more, and unfortunately, a lot of people in the lower socioeconomic classes don't get nearly as much legal support as they deserve. That's a whole other story, right? But that was certainly not the case for former President Trump, and I think the really wonderful thing is that ultimately the law applies to us all. Now he has a right to appeal. Anybody who is convicted has a right to appeal, right? But I think what is really important is one of the things that the Jewish tradition and the American tradition share is this commitment to the law governing us all, even in the highest positions. By the way, another thing that the Jewish tradition and the American tradition share is the sense of respect for the individual. In the case of the American tradition, it's because we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So as an American, I'm an individual with rights,
Mhm.
right? As a Jew, we leave Egypt not as an individual. As individuals, we leave as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments, right?
Right.
As I say to Christian audiences, this is the beginning of Jewish guilt. And Catholics tell me we know nothing about guilt. They have that cornered.
Oh,
Um,
right.
I'll
Right.
do that to them, right? But there's this sense of being an individual created by God. Also gives a real strong sense of respect for the individual in the Jewish tradition, as there is also respect for the individual in the American tradition for different reasons. But that's not to be taken for granted. I mean, if you look at communist societies, there really is no respect for the individual. There are no individual rights per se in places like China and Russia, right? And so, I mean, the fact that we share this is really not to be taken for granted. I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and the Silverman Prayer Book had a reading, the America based on biblical principles,
Uh-huh.
and that reading
Okay.
also was in the later prayer books of the conservative movement, and certainly in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, American Jews wanted to believe that their American identity and their Jewish identity were one and the same, and that they completely reinforced each other. Now that's not true. Okay, I mean there are real differences between these two parts of American Jewish identity, right? But there are some real overlaps. The two that I was just talking about, the fact that law governs us all, and the fact that we have to respect each other. Those I think are really important overlaps in our Jewish and our American the Jewish and American parts of our identity.
Yeah, I'd love to stage have a machloket and stage a debate between you and let's bring Mordecai Kaplan back, where Kaplan famously observes in his questions Jews ask that, how Jewish should I be and how American should I be? He's asked. And he says, the point is not to be 50% American and 50% Jewish, but 100% and wholly American Jewish. And
Yes.
while I find that compelling, I also reserve some critical perspective that I believe you do too, to say
Right.
there are points of separation and there are points of tension. Maybe they're even creative tensions, but they're certainly not identical.
That's right.
Yeah. Still, in exploring that, we were fortunate enough a couple months ago to have a webinar about do America and democracy need one another? Had some very fine speakers, and doctors Bill Plevin and Eric Kaplan both explored why it was that Kaplan believed that democracy was the religion of America, that democracy had the potential to bridge, to connect, to form a commonality, even to the point that he would join Eugene Cohn and Paul Williams in writing a book, The Faith of America, that had lots of reading about the 4th of July and shared holidays. And I wonder what you think about that, whether in some sense democracy can be fruitfully thought of as the faith of America.
Well, I think the answer is yes. I really do think so. And it goes back to the founding fathers. I mean, if you read um, James Madison's Federalist Papers, or if you read Thomas Jefferson, who had a very strong sense, Jefferson, actually, almost all of the founding fathers were deists. That is, they believed in a creative force. They didn't believe in a personal God. Therefore, we hold these truths to be self-evident that we're all created by that all men were created, right, by their creator. They didn't say God in the Declaration of Independence. They said their creator because they were talking about the creative force that they believed in, because they were all deists, right? But even
Right.
so, somebody like Jefferson, who, by the way, rewrote the New Testament in a humanist way, right? Nevertheless, believed that religion was really important, because he believed that without religion, people would not learn how to be moral. But he believed that there had to be a wall of separation between church and state. That was his term, right? Because in order for there to be in order for there to be a vibrant society, individuals would have their own religions and would be able to talk to each other about their religions, but would not impose their own religion on anybody else, right? Hence the First Amendment, freedom of religion, but no establishment of any one religion, right? And they were very strongly under. I mean, remember they were revolting against a country in which there was an established religion, right? And and there was a king. So they were interested in, and George Washington wanted to make sure that he didn't serve more than 2 terms so that he would not become the king,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So
Right.
it was very, and that was what happened by custom until FDR. And then you got, when he broke that custom, then you got the 22nd Amendment to say that no, as a matter of fact, the president may not serve for more than 2 terms, because we need to be able to have we need to be able to have democratically elected people who change from time to time in order to be able to make sure that power in government is in fact in the hands of the people. I had a wonderful U.S. history teacher in high school, um, and we spent about a third of the first semester on the Constitution, and she said we were going to have a big test on the Constitution, and she told us
Okay.
what the first question was and what the first answer was. And the first question was, who wrote the Constitution? And if we said Jefferson and Madison, that was wrong. It was we, the people. Now, I don't
Okay,
remember
that's
much from
lovely.
high school, right?
That stuck.
But that really stuck, right? I mean, the point is that what the founding fathers are really very much committed to was a sense of democracy being the way in which we interact with each other and we rule each other. Right? In other words, we come to ruling our country together, right? So I mean, I think yes, I think democracy really is inherent in what it means to be America. And if we lose that, then we're in really bad trouble. And so that's what I'm worried about in terms of the way in which former President Trump has basically attacked the institutions of democracy. I mean, he can certainly have his opinions about whatever he wants to talk about, right? But to say that I should be above the law, we'll find out this week whether the Supreme Court
Yeah,
with that or not. Right.
right.
But the notion that anybody should be above the law, I think, is really detrimental to the future of America. Um, and I think it's really important to respect the institutions of America, right? And in order for that to happen, again, that doesn't mean that they can't be criticized. They certainly can be. Doesn't mean that there can't be changes. There certainly can be. That's what democracy is all about, right? That's the reason why you have legislators and all of that, right? But there has to be a basic understanding that we're in this together and that we need each other in order to be able to not only to survive, let alone thrive.
Thank you. That's a very articulate and helpful response. Elliot, I think I'm going to end on a more speculative note, inviting you to join in my delight in having got, as I do almost every week, a note from Dr. Mel Sculpt, the Kaplan scholar of his diaries and our vice president at the Kaplan Center.
Mhm.
This wonderful guy and always digging, always digging. So he wrote to me this past week, Jeffrey, I have a cold, and so I just haven't been very productive. But all of a sudden, I had this insight about Kaplan. Kaplan said he was born into a totally Jewish world, a totally Jewish civilization. That was who he was, the traditional upbringing he had. And then he says, and I was reborn into two civilizations. In the next stage of his becoming who he was, he had to balance and reap the fruits of both of those. And I am thinking these days that when you're reborn into two civilizations, it's a lot of he knew there's a lot of education. You're not surprised to hear me hear that because a lot of people get reborn with insubstantial backgrounds or identities that are not yet secure. So I'm wondering if you think, as his um, sharing made me think that I, as someone who is born in a primarily American family with some strong Jewish commitment, but primarily American, that I've taken for granted that Americanness, and that to be reborn into two civilizations, as Kaplan would say, requires almost as much attention to the American side of who we are as to the Jewish. And Elliot and I met at Camp Ramah, and of course, the big agenda at Camp Ramah is to help people who have certainly Jewish identities live in an immersive environment where Judaism deepens. And that was our task. I'm wondering if, given what you said in the beginning and the fragility of democracy, if we shouldn't see our work now, as we are constantly reborn to two civilizations, as requiring a reacquisition of the best of democracy and the skills that allow for respectful dialogue, common purpose. It struck me with some great force that I generally take that for granted, and maybe I have to work as hard on the American side of who I am as on the Jewish side. So I
Yeah,
was excited about that and wondered what you thought.
absolutely right. I mean, I think that if we are going to fulfill our obligations, I'm going to talk real Jewish now, right? If
Okay.
we're going to fulfill our obligations to both Judaism and to America, we have to be fully committed to both. And that means learning a lot about both, and doing what we can to foster both, individually and in connection with one another. I think that is our duty to America as an American citizen, and to try to make this the most fruitful and creative society that a multicultural society can be, and is and has been. As I mentioned toward the beginning, a lot of innovations have come from America, many more than from most other countries. And I think in order for that to happen, we as Americans have to be deeply rooted in American values and in American ideals for the future. And on the other hand, we also have to be, as Jews, we have to learn a lot in order to be Jewish. I mean, it's one thing to be born Jewish, and it's another thing to know what that means, and to know what that means, both in terms of how I should live my life and how I should interact with others, and what my mission in life is, right? And I think in order to be an American Jew and do both of them right, you've got to learn a lot. As a matter of fact, I work at what is now called the American Jewish University. It was
Uh-huh.
called the University of Judaism because Kaplan wrote a commencement speech in 1945 at the seminary called A University of Judaism. You can see it as the last chapter of his book of the future of the American Jew, in which he imagined a school of higher learning that would, in fact, teach classical Jewish texts, but also teach all the civilizational aspects of Judaism: art, music, dance, etc., right? Drama. And he actually wanted the seminary to be the University of Judaism, but Chancellor Finkelstein would have nothing to do with that. But in the meantime, after the Second World War, the Jewish community on the West Coast had really blossomed. A lot of people were moving here, and there was a real need for creating Jewish teachers for the new generation of Jews, and that's what led to the establishment of the University of Judaism here, which when I first got here in 1971, um, had not only courses in Judaica, but actually degrees, including a doctorate of fine arts that you could get here. Um, and because we had all kinds of courses on that. And then when we moved to the new facility, there was a graphic studio, a plastic studio, a dance studio with the wooden boards and the mirrors and all of that, and
Wow.
a theater, um, where we had the Los Angeles Philharmonic many years and all of that kind of thing, right? Because in order to be fully Jewish in Kaplan's understanding of things, it was a matter of learning the classical text and learning, how to act as a Jew, both in moral situations and in the rituals of Judaism, but also to learn how to integrate that with 20th century, now 21st century culture.
Elliot, I want to thank you. Your perspectives have been interesting, challenging, reassuring, all of those mixed together. And it's what I hoped it would be a good revisiting of where we've come to the last year and a half with the richness of all your teaching and learning and your perspectives. So, and thank you for that little icing on the cake about the history, Mordecai Kaplan, and his impact on the creation of the University of Judaism. So
Okay.
be well, and again, thank you, and we'll send this tape on to you when we have it ready to share with the
My
wider
pleasure.
audience. Okay,
Absolutely. Okay.
okay. Sure you want the yes.